Usually I just have the content warnings like just on the screen for a few seconds in the beginning so you know the kind of gist of what you're getting into. But honestly, with this person, there's just a general content warning for literally everything you might be able to imagine. Basically, if it's vile, horrific, disgusting, overall inhumane, just kind of proceed with caution. I'm not really going to thoroughly discuss every single awful thing that this person's ever done, but I might mention some things very briefly here and there. Now, with that out of the way, hopefully the title of this video didn't make you, like, unsubscribe to my channel instantly. It's mildly clickbait, but I do have some thoughts, and this is going to be, like, a hell of a lot of rambling, but I just kind of felt like I had to get it out there since I saw that this person was trending on Twitter once again, and this time due to the fact that they are back online. Enough beating around the bush. For those of you who don't know anything about Chris Chan, you are incredibly lucky and should leave now and hold on to some peace and innocence in your life. But if you are still here to listen to me ramble about this topic, Chris Chan is an internet lolcow who has been documented extensively by the internet historians to a frankly freakish degree since the early 2000s. If you want to see the life and times of Chris Chan in documentary form, go check out Genial Samuel like everyone else. Now, quickly for even more people, what is a lolcow? The best way to describe a lolcow is someone who is often really highly emotional and really easy to rile up by trolls when you find entertainment in someone's reaction to their bullying, harassment, abuse, etc. I could, define lolcow and subsequently the trolls who, bother them a little nicer, but at the end of the day, most lolcows are people who are just really, really tormented on the internet to near breaking points, or in some cases, past their breaking points, whether they seem to really deserve that kind of attention or not. Chris Chan is arguably one of the most infamous lolcows in internet history, not only to the degree of people bothering them, but also due to their mental state through the years while enduring the internet abuse. While I believe Chris Chan is a deplorable human being, fuck them, I often think about who they could have been if they were treated with more common respect, human decency, and if they were getting the various forms of medical treatment that they really, really desperately need. Hey there, I'm here to interrupt your regularly scheduled entertainment. So last year, I was among the blissful populace who had never even heard of the individual known as Chris Chan, and life was almost good. Then I saw the name trending on Twitter once and fell down a very, very terrifying rabbit hole of some of the most foulest shit you can imagine. For everyone still ignorant, despite the very long intro I did, and those that don't want to take the plunge into the over 70-part documentary series about this person, Chris Chan is a hard person to explain nicely. They are a severely mentally handicapped individual who suffers from, very extreme delusions that drastically affect their everyday life. Their delusions often result in them acting out not only online but in public settings, which have resulted in a variety of civil and criminal legal issues. Often what gets Chris Chan into the most trouble is their gullibility and complete lack of impulse control. Chris entirely reflects the environment around themselves in a very dangerous way, thus making them completely insufferable to watch and listen to. But while we can all view Chris as a disgusting and insufferable person, I think it would be remiss to ignore what kind of environments Chris was raised in and endured through the years, both offline and online, that caused them to become this kind of person. To start with, Chris's early examples of disgusting behavior revolved around recreating the thoughts and opinions of their parents. It's very plain to see in the early footage of Chris's life that their parents really did not want to be raising another child, already having fully grown adult children by the time that Chris was born. Even if Chris didn't really recognize that their parents were negligent towards them, like all children, Chris was very desperate for love, attention, and parental approval. That need for approval, coupled with Chris not being able to really form their own viewpoints unaided, is what I believe leads up to pretty much everything wrong about Chris Chan as a person. From the early years, Chris was undeniably sexist towards AFAB women, bigoted towards the LGBT community, racist, you name it. These viewpoints, no doubt, stemming from Chris's father, as he was heard, saying very bigoted and racist remarks in old audio recordings that have been archived. Additionally to Chris's, emulating personality traits from their parents, Chris was also raised in, a hoarding environment, which I've been in that kind of situation. It's fucking awful, which they continue to emulate, like, the hoarding environment if you look at pictures of their living spaces, like their old bedrooms, their new house, like, all that stuff. It is knowing just from the earliest examples of Chris's life that they have a drastic issue breaking away from emulating the thoughts and behaviors of others, as well as the physical environment that Chris was subjected to, that I believe that Chris should have been removed from their parents' home and placed within a specialized home for people more experienced in mental health care that Chris obviously really needs. I think if Chris was placed early on with people more capable of taking care of them, Chris might have been able to learn better coping strategies for living a life as an adult and might not have picked up as many negative character traits that they are known for now. Chris is kind of like a chameleon in that regard, in which they incorporate the traits of those that give them attention in order for them to form kind of like their melting pot or Frankenstein-like personality, whether or not that attention is positive or negative. My proof of Chris being able to, like, alter their perspective and, like, be a better person is, evident when seeing Chris engage with people who they think are being nice to them. While many people who interact with Chris, like, over the years have been trolls trying to trick or cause conflict, some people have been kind of kind to them to a certain extent, even if the attention did kind of start off with the intention of being a troll. I think some people who turned out to be kind to Chris were trolls, like, in the beginning, who kind of lost steam for the harassment campaign when they realized that Chris just wasn't some moron, but rather just someone extremely gullible and disabled that they were tormenting, which frankly I'm like upset on behalf of Chris, like even though I don't like them as a person. I'm upset for Chris in this regard because it is like vile in itself that so many people chose to torment someone like Chris this long. It is rather shocking to see such like blatant ableism and just being able to mentally torture someone mentally disabled for this long to the degree that Chris has been able to endure this for years and years, with most people not even showing a shred of remorse. When shown kindness, even just the people being polite enough for them for the sake of not being a complete monster to a disabled person, Chris was capable of being reasoned with and kind of learn about new perspectives in their life. This is most evidently seen in their change in the beliefs in regards to their LGBT community. Now, I know there's been, like, a lot of, like, major discourse within, like, the Chris Chan saga about the validity of their identity, but in my experience as a non-binary person myself, you don't just go out of your way to drastically alter your appearance in the same regards that Chris has if you are faking it. I know I've been like using neutral pronouns this like entire video, or at least trying to when talking about Chris, but that is mostly because I've seen that people have claimed pretty consistently that Chris admitted to faking being transgender in order to hook up with lesbians or something to that degree, and like other sects have denied that Chris said that and people are just being transphobic against them. Regardless of which is true, I'm keeping like the neutral pronoun stance since like I don't know Chris well enough as a person, and honestly don't want to get to know Chris as a person, but I don't know them as a person enough to deny them a queer identity. Just because a queer person turns out to be like a bad, deplorable person doesn't really invalidate who they are. Queerness is an aspect of a person and not an indicator of whether or not they are good or bad, and we need to really stop acting like it is. I can go in like a whole spiel about like, you know, the purity of representation, yada yada, but that's not what this video is about. Now, since Chris was raised by parents who like clearly did not want to actually raise a child, Chris was exposed to far more fictional media than I think was really healthy for them, like as an individual to consume. For average people, which I do mean average in both like the neurotypical as well as the neurodivergent sense, consuming a metric fuck ton of fiction isn't really going to warp your physical reality. But with Chris constantly absorbing traits that they're exposed to, Chris was really unable to separate themselves from the fiction that they consume. While at one point that might not have been like the case entirely, I feel that the issue began to like drastically escalate to the dangerous and unhealthy degree that it is now from people continuously harassing Chris. The degree in which Chris has been tormented over the years has been truly heartbreaking and deplorable to witness. Even as a bystander through Gino Samuel's like documentary series, despite Chris's flaws, which there are many that are disgusting by themselves, I don't think Chris deserved being doxxed, stalked, and continuously threatened in the manner that they have been over the years, both online and physically in person. Just like I mentioned before that Chris has been shown to like be able to absorb the positive qualities when someone is nice to them, they also are equally able to absorb the negative qualities from people who, are assholes towards them. Chris being mean, spiteful, vindictive are all qualities that I feel that they accumulated through people's constant mistreatment of them. When you are constantly being stalked, harassed, people calling your house, threatening to kill you, and more, it's no longer surprising when the person subjected to all of that just kind of like hits a breaking point and can no longer respond to normal stressors in a reasonable way. Which is like what I feel like is made like 100 times worse by Chris's mental disabilities, right? I honestly and firmly believe that due to all of the actual psychological torture that these trolls have put Chris through over the years has caused them to develop a form of PTSD, but like, I'm not a psychologist. I find it rather horrifying just how normalized it was like to witness and hear about people tracking Chris down offline, like in real life, in order to harass them. People having a good laugh about the incident involving a man in a pickle outfit was honestly pretty alarming, because it was at that degree that I realized that people didn't just view Chris as a person anymore, but just an object of entertainment to harass. I mean, for Christ's sakes, I've seen like some points of the documentary in which people like literally have traveled cross state lines in order to go find and harass Chris in person. Through this whole saga, I honestly have very little respect for everyone involved in breaking Chris down again and again. It's really no surprise that Chris would end up retreating into the realm of fiction, especially since Chris's delusions left them fairly incapable of separating fiction from their reality. While real life would lead them to being constantly tormented and harassed, like I mentioned before, fictional characters naturally are completely incapable of being cruel to Chris personally. I feel as through like the negligence that Chris experienced throughout childhood, from being ignored both by family and peers, due to ableism, that Chris ended up retracting into their own imagination more and more, where they could finally control the narrative and make people be nice to them for once, even if it was fictional characters like Sonic and Pikachu and other Pokemon. Chris was using their artwork at first sort of like a diary in my perspective, documenting how they wished their life was progressing, which included things like friends, lovers, and even telling off people that they disliked. But at some point, through the mental turmoil that they experienced, they really stopped viewing it so much as a diary of sorts, but rather just how life really was in some alternate dimension. Which, when they started mentioning these kind of delusions, is when I realized that Chris was kind of incapable of existing in society unsupervised. During the duration of Chris's experiences with trolling and other online harassment, we've seen countless times that Chris really seems to be incapable of saying no when pushed to the brink. We've seen it when people forcibly demanded Chris cause themselves bodily harm by shoving things inside of themselves, convincing them that they needed to recycle their bodily fluids by ingesting them, and even feeding into the delusions that the alternate reality was real. It's at this point where Chris firmly actually legitimately believes that there is a mystical alternate reality where we're all gods and superpowers and yada yada, and that reality is going to merge with our real one soon. And people continuing to harass them, that we seem to have come to the point where we are now. People have used Chris's delusions to get them to do a lot of things, like traveling across the country, giving money to trolls and belongings to be destroyed, and so much, much more. But it is when Chris is told stories of the alternate reality and what is going on there, and Chris believing those wild tales as reality, is when things really started to really escalate in terms of deranged danger for not only Chris, but those around Chris as well. If you haven't caught on yet, I really think that Chris needs to be institutionalized due to everything going on with him mentally, but we're still getting into stuff here. In 2021, Chris Chan was arrested for the charge of incest, which is a felony in the state of Virginia where they live. It was through leaked text messages and a leaked audio recording of a phone call between Chris and another person that Chris seemingly admitted to having sexual relations with their mother, who has dementia. And now, in 2023, Chris was released from jail and the charges for incest were dropped, and people are upset, confused, and overall shocked from them being released after having non-consensual interactions with their own mother with failing mental health. Everything about this entire situation is arguably some of the most horrific stuff that's gone on in the whole, Christery, as you might call it. And also this situation, just to know, is when I really started noticing people stopped treating Chris Chan as, an overall joke, and more of, this is serious, maybe we shouldn't be fucking around with this person, But of course, there's also, like, the sect of internet trolls that are still pointing and laughing and eating all this shit up, which is disgusting. But anyway, back on topic. The knowledge that the charges against Chris were dropped for this incident make me wonder if Chris's confession was even real. And if it was this just another thing that, like, the hate mob had convinced them to do? On one hand, Chris's constant struggle with coping with reality and the belief that an alternate reality is going to merge with our own has led Chris to believing a lot of things that internet trolls have told them over the years. It wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility that someone had convinced Chris that the alternate reality version of themselves had done these vile actions against their mother and fed into the delusion, and Chris subsequently just filled in the details. Chris has time and time again been able to spin very bold and imaginative stories based on their delusions, and they are so solid in their belief that all of this, like, delusional stuff is real, that it would be sad but not surprising for Chris to be convinced that they were guilty of something that the harassers had told them their alternate reality self had done. The incest charges could have been dropped due to the investigators realizing that Chris lives in a world of delusions and fantasy, and that the recorded confession might not have been a reliable source of information due to this. And I think it took so long for the charges to get dropped because Chris is really, really heavily documented on the internet, so they probably needed to just rifle through and sort through tons and tons and tons of information from YouTube and Kiwi Farms and, like, literally everywhere around the internet. However, on the other side of this, if Chris really had committed this crime, would they have done it of their own volition or at the behest of more people harassing Chris into doing it? After all, I've mentioned that Chris had difficulty saying no to things that their detractors, like, screamed at them to do, which one time ended up with them doing things to cause themselves bodily harm, like attempting to mutilate their genitals at one point. While it seems more likely that Chris was capable of the crimes against their mother due to their issues with, like, personal space and boundaries with people that they seem to be attracted to, it equally seems plausible that this could have just been something people had convinced them that their mother secretly wanted, or something that they were actively doing in their delusional alternative reality fantasy nonsense. Chris really did commit this heinous crime. Part of why the charges were dropped could have been due to the mental state of their mother. With claims of sexual abuse, Chris's mom was most likely examined by medical professionals to see if something was really happening to her, but not all sexual abuse has to lead to signs of physical harm, especially if the incidents are spread out enough for, like, lubricants and bodily fluids and other evidence to kind of, like, be healed or washed away. With Chris's mom clearly having dementia, even if it's, like, not, like, formally diagnosed, I don't know her, but yeah, it would have been hard or even impossible to get her side of the story if the medical examination led to inconclusive results or didn't even uncover anything. But whether or not Chris really did sexually abuse their mother is not necessarily something to debate, because the confession is enough to see that the way that Chris is operating in their day-to-day life is extremely dangerous. If they didn't actually end up committing this crime, then it just proves that they are way too easily manipulated to remain safe in society on their own, and is clearly unfit to care for their aging mother. However, if Chris did commit the crime, either by their own desire or had the notion forcibly planted within themselves by abusive trolls, then it proves once again that Chris is unfit to be a functional member of society and needs to be placed within a care facility of some sort so they can't harm themselves or anybody else. They should not have internet access either, since it is shown again and again that they are constantly put in danger due to trolls feeding into their delusions. Chris needs to be placed in a way in which, like, a sensible caregiver or a team of providers can adequately and continuously keep them grounded in reality. They need years of extensive therapy and probably antipsychotic medications, honestly. Unfortunately, though, America fails their mentally disabled citizens arguably probably the hardest out of, like, any, like, group of people medically, so it's unlikely that Chris would ever be able to get the kind of help that they really desperately need. In due time, it's most likely that Chris is going to kind of, like, end up back in prison for something or another, or even homeless due to being unable to care for themselves financially, physically, and mentally. Someone is going to end up harassing Chris to another breaking point, and the internet will collectively point and laugh because that's all they want out of Chris, to be a miserable person, to be as miserable as physically possible. Everything involving Chris should have been fixed years and years ago. If Child Protective Services had gotten involved, Chris could have been given proper treatment as a child and learned things like physical boundaries and better coping strategies with making friends and dealing with other people. Chris might have even been able to meet other people with the same interest and passions for those interests, people around, their own age instead of like, internet trolls and children. Chris might have been able to receive the therapy that they needed to avoid these like really wild delusions of alternate realities too. If people had never decided to torment and harass a mentally disabled person all those years ago as ableist entertainment, Chris probably never even would have gotten to this degree of infamy and notoriety that they are known for now. If no one decided that cruelty would be hilarious, Chris would have just faded into the background of the internet, screaming into the void like so many other people do, because, in the most politest way I can word this, besides being the most harassed lolcow in history, Chris doesn't really have the talent or personable qualities that are needed to really gain legitimate popularity online in a natural way. Chris Chan would not be the most documented person online if people had just left them alone. Chris is a vile and disgusting person, but they were made worse by the internet, and honestly, it sickens me. And that's my non-professional armchair psychoanalyzing of Chris Chan and their delusions and the state in which their detractors have frankly made these delusions so much worse. It's not really a defense of Chris as a person, despite the clickbait title of the video or thumbnail or whatever I decided to use, because again, I really don't like Chris. No surprise, I can't really imagine many people that legitimately do like Chris, but I wanted to voice how trolling made them infinitely much more worse as a person. Let me know what you think in the comments, like this video for the analytics, and subscribe for more content, please. This video, like all of my content, is brought to you by Patreon, so thank you so much to Ippo, Chrome, Alec, and Ashley for subscribing. If you want to help me pay for some medical bills and support me on Patreon, tiers start as little as $1 a month. You can get access to some cool perks like monthly discount code to my Etsy store, a Patreon-specific Discord server, early access, and more. Just be forewarned though that my Patreon is adults only, so please keep that in mind prior to subscribing. Anyway, this is Minji signing off. Until next time.
I can't move on till I let go. I feel so lost, never at home. Need to be strong, every breath hold. 'Cause I can't move on till I let go.